everybody, welcome to Learn with Steph. This is one of the videos as part of our Lessons in Law series. The focus is on OCR A Level Law, but it will be useful to anybody studying law. If you like the videos, please do subscribe and press the like button at the bottom. Today's lesson is our second on delegated or secondary legislation. In our first lesson, we looked at what it is and the different types of delegated legislation. This lesson, we're going to turn to how delegated legislation is controlled. Our questions will be, why does it need controls? How does Parliament control delegated legislation? And we're going to evaluate these controls. So our focus are going to be on parliamentary controls. First of all, why does delegated legislation need to be controlled? Well, remember what it is. It's law made by somebody other than Parliament, but under Parliament's authority. So Parliament is our elected body. It's our supreme lawmaker. It's made up of people who are elected or trusted to make our law. Delegated legislation, however, may well be written and made by people who are not elected, so don't have the public's backing necessarily. Also, when a law is made through Parliament, as we have seen in our previous lessons, it's subject to a whole process, making sure the law is scrutinised in detail for any mistakes or any problems. Secondary legislation doesn't go through all this scrutiny. And finally, because it's made by people who aren't elected and therefore are not accountable to the public in the same way as MPs are, we need to ensure that power is not being abused. Delegated legislation can be controlled before it gets passed and afterwards. When it's before, it's controlled by Parliament, but afterwards the court will consider it, and these are called judicial controls. That will be for our next lesson. The first parliamentary control is the Enabling Act. Now, the Enabling Act gives power to make delegated legislation, but it not only gives power, it also limits the power. These days, most acts are enabling acts, enabling delegated legislation to take place. If the Enabling Act doesn't do this, there can be no secondary law. So the Enabling Act makes secondary legislation possible. How does the Enabling Act limit or control secondary legislation? Well, you remember three easy questions: who, what, how. So first of all, the who. The Enabling Act states who can make the law. So with our example of the content of the national curriculum, the Enabling Act was the Education Reform Act, 1988. And the Enabling Act, the Education Reform Act, stated that the Minister for Education could make the law, could make the content of the national curriculum. What can the Minister of Education or whoever's been given the power do? So in other words, it says exactly what laws can be made. And in the example that we've used of the Education Reform Act 1988, it stated that the Education Minister could make the content of the national curriculum for each year. And then the how, because the Enabling Act will also lay down the procedure, particularly who should be consulted in order to make that secondary legislation. So obviously, for the Education Reform Act, the Minister of Education was required to contact perhaps teaching unions, businesses, universities, anyone that might be interested in contributing to the content of the national curriculum. We've already used the Education Reform Act of 1988, but another example you could use that we've mentioned in our previous lessons is the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991. And this act gave the Home Secretary, that's the WHO, the power to add more breeds of dangerous dogs. So that's the what. We presume the procedure would be to discuss, to consult with perhaps the police, looking at examples of where dogs may have attacked people, and even possibly the RSPCA. Another control are different committees. There's a joint select committee, there's a statutory, a secondary legislation scrutiny committee. Now the scrutiny committee, they review all statutory instruments before they become law. So it's a committee that looks at just one type, statutory instruments. They're looking at it to make sure really that they've obeyed the constraints of the Enabling Act. If they find anything wrong though, the scrutiny committee's power is quite limited. They can draw it to Parliament's attention, and which they will do if they find the law imposes a tax or doesn't follow the rules set up in the Enabling Act. It has a retrospective effect. In other words, the law is starting before the law has passed, or is perhaps unclear, so not written very well. But all it can do is report it to Parliament, so draw it to Parliament's attention. And that can lead to a minister being questioned about the statutory instrument. But the scrutiny committee can't annul these instruments and can't amend them at all. All they can do is report a problem. It would actually be up to Parliament to address any of these problems. Another control by Parliament are resolutions. And again, these refer to statutory instruments. And there are two types of resolutions, and these are sometimes called procedures. So the negative procedure or resolution and the positive procedure or resolution. The negative resolution is far more common. So the negative resolution basically means that when a piece of delegated legislation is written, it will be open to Parliament to look at, and it's open for 40 days. And basically, if no one has objected or formally rejected this piece of delegated legislation, it will automatically become law. So it doesn't need Parliament to vote on it. Most delegated legislation, or rather most statutory instruments, become law through the negative resolution. The affirmative resolution, though, is a much more stringent control. It's far less common, and the Enabling Act will state in it if the piece of delegated legislation has to go through the affirmative procedure. basically, if it's an affirmative resolution statutory instrument, it won't become law unless Parliament has voted it in. So Parliament has to formally approve the law. This tends to be used for controversial statutory instruments, such as the codes of practice for police that were made possible under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984. There is even something called the super affirmative resolution procedure, and this extends ministers' powers under the affirmative resolution. Before we move to the evaluation, I'd just like to remind you of one other parliamentary control that you may have forgotten about, and that's the one for bylaws. If you remember, all bylaws have to be confirmed by the minister that is relevant to that bylaw. So a bylaw related to water authority would need to be confirmed by the energy minister. And that's another way of controlling these pieces of secondary legislation. Okay, so evaluation. Think about what we've just learned about parliamentary controls. Can you already see problems? Because if you can cut down your revision in this area because you already know it, it can help you a great deal. So first of all, the Enabling Act. Now clearly this is a really important control, and because Parliament creates the Enabling Act, it means that it has ultimate control over all delegated legislation, doesn't it? Because it can repeal the Enabling Act, take away those powers given or amend those powers through its own legislative process. But this takes time, as we know. So the likelihood of this happening is quite slim. Looking at negative resolution, this is used for most statutory instruments. Now, in reality, if there's 3,000 statutory instruments approximately being created every year, and most of them are going through the negative resolution, how likely is it that all of those have the real scrutiny of Parliament? In reality, very few are probably looked at in detail. If a statutory instrument is going through the positive resolution, we know that's a much more stringent, so therefore a much more effective control. But if Parliament doesn't like it, all it can do is annul it or withdraw it. It can't be amended through Parliament. It would have to be rewritten and then go back to Parliament through a positive resolution. Then if we think about the Scrutiny Committee, whose job it is to look at all those 3,000 statutory instruments, again, highly unlikely that the committee will look at them really, really thoroughly. And a lot of those statutory instruments are really technical. If you remember, one of the advantages of delegated legislation was expertise, because so many statutory instruments are technical. Now, example for this could be building regulations. Now, obviously, people on the Scrutiny Committee have a lot of experience, but it's unlikely that they're going to be experts in all those areas that they're going to come across through reading the statutory instruments. Do they really have enough expertise to make a valid judgment, particularly on whether or not the actual law is clearly written? They may be able to check that it hasn't gone beyond the Enabling Act, but whether they can really understand all the nuances of some of the more technical issues, it's questionable. And again, The scrutiny committee's power is really limited. A bit like the positive resolution here. It can't amend the statutory instrument in any way. All it can do is make a recommendation to Parliament for it to be looked at. Now, knowing Parliament's busy schedule, again, very few of them are. So there's several evaluative points you can make about parliamentary controls. If you were doing a question, such as describe parliamentary controls on delegated legislation, you would be writing probably 4 paragraphs. You'd start with why controls are needed, then you do a paragraph on Enabling Act, a paragraph on the scrutiny committee, and then a paragraph on the resolutions. One of the problems with this question is candidates often go down the evaluative route instead of just the AO1, the content route, if you like. Okay, so be careful if you get a question like this. Another quick tip for this question is you need to pack your answer with loads of good examples. So hopefully you are now able to not only explain why secondary legislation needs to be carefully controlled, but also to describe some of the key parliamentary controls there are and some of the issues that we have with these controls. The next lesson is going to be on judicial controls. Tune into that one, and if you like the video, please like and subscribe. That brings us to the end of this lesson in law. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like it and subscribe to find more videos. Bye.